Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Massachusetts Municipal Association's Essentials of Capital Planning webinar. We have a great group of over 300 attendees with us today. I am Jeremy Marset, the town administrator for the town of Sherburne, and a former town engineer and public works director in other communities. I'll be moderating today's webinar that will highlight best practices for maintaining a community's capital access. Panelists will offer guidance on developing a capital plan, managing debt, and how to build buy-in for these projects across constituencies. First, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is 75 minutes. We will take all questions during the last 25 minutes of the session during the Q&A. Please type all questions today into the Q&A section. We will not be allowed verbal questions, and the chat will not be monitored for questions. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the MMA website and MMA on demand within the next few days. All attendees will also receive the link to this recording via email along with the presentation slides. Now I'd like to turn things over to our first presenter, Casey Vick from the Division of Local Services Financial Management Resource Bureau.
Great, thanks so much, Jeremy. All right, I'll share my screen. I'll get this presentation started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Very excited to talk about some capital planning today. Just a little bit about me. I have been with the DLS Financial Management Bureau for about 3 years. Before that, I worked as a treasurer collector in local government and in the assessing office as well. I'm just going to start off quick overview of today's presentation for myself. We're just going to talk a little bit about DLS and FMRB. Then we're just going to talk about the high-level capital planning fundamentals. And then we'll cover some of our best practices, and then we'll wrap up with highlighting some of the tools and resources we can offer to your communities. So hopefully a lot of you are already familiar with us, the Division of Local Services, or DLS. We do outreach to all 351 communities throughout the state. We're always looking to be helpful, and we love doing outreach like this on presentations and anything that we can assist with. I'm personally with the Financial Management Resource Bureau, which is a bureau within DLS. We assist communities with a variety of projects. We are known for our financial management reviews, but we also do things like financial policies, capital planning, and just cover different areas of best practice. Anything that we can be useful for. So we're always looking for feedback of what your communities are in need of and what guidance that you're looking for. We'll start off with an overview of capital investment plan and why it's important for every community to have. A lot of you might be familiar with our classic DLS Venn diagram here. We view a capital investment plan as one of the core pillars to strong financial management. A good capital plan identifies the needs and goals of the community and helps really facilitate a long-term plan of implementing those objectives. The benefits of a comprehensive capital plan really centers on the predictability of capital expenses and having a strategic outlook that reduces the risk of the unexpected or emergency costs. And this also helps build trust in your community, being able to show your residents and taxpayers your long-term plan and really try to get their buy-in to how and when you're going to be fulfilling those capital expenses. Speaking from a high-level perspective, a good capital plan identifies and implements the needs, priorities, affordability, and capacity for your community. These look different for every city and town throughout the state. So we're just speaking about high level of how you can do the main steps of your capital planning process, how to build it up, whether you're starting from scratch or whether you have a capital plan but you want to reinvigorate and really strengthen it. The first part of a capital process is identifying your capital assets in your city or town. You have municipal property like equipment, vehicles, technology, and you have infrastructure like your buildings, your utilities, your roads. In order to capture the whole picture of all your assets, you'll want to look at different community documents and records. If you're starting from scratch, insurance records can be very helpful, just knowing what you're actually covering. A lot of this is found in the accounting department. The accounting department also has fixed asset records. Departments also should have their own records of assets that might be unique to their own departments, especially public safety offices like police, fire, and DPW. And the assessing department will have property records for buildings and land that are owned by your municipality. All of these, especially again, if you're starting from a weak capital plan or maybe just trying to start the process over, gathering as much information from all the different sources is really a great starting point. Just because you probably have all the information, but might be scattered in different places. So really just gathering it all so that you can do the next part, which is building your capital inventory. So after you've identified all the assets in your community, you'll want to compile that information into this inventory. The inventory should be comprehensive in the information it provides for each asset. So asset information should include things like the date built or acquired, last improved, the original cost or value, as well as the current or depreciated value. Your inventory should also detail how this asset is used. How frequently is it used? What's the importance of it? What need does it fulfill in your community? And what is it related value to that usage? The more information you include in your asset inventory, the more context you'll have to guide in prioritizing your purchase of additional or replacement of these assets. So it's really important that your inventory goes beyond just what you have and what it is. You want to be able to hand this, whether it's to another department head or a taxpayer that's never been to town meeting. You would like to be able to show this inventory and have each page be a really holistic picture of the asset that it's describing and why it's useful for your community. After you've identified your assets and you've compiled them into an inventory, you really want to establish a rubric for how you then prioritize your capital needs. So capital requests, any that are incoming, should be categorized by the reason for their need. So is it because of a public health or safety issue? Is it required by law? These things are important to note because they might have a higher priority level due to their urgency or due to maybe a mandate. But then you have other things like, is the capital request maintaining the current operational services? So that when you present this to, say, a town meeting and say, we need to have this capital expense, people need to understand this is because it directly contributes to our current operational services. In order to maintain those, we need to have this capital expenditure. But there are other things like improvement to in-service or efficiencies, and also things that just add to the social, cultural, historic value to your community. So it's important to establish consistent rating system for all types of capital requests. Your prioritization method should reference any formal policies you have around capital goals or funding or strategies. And this rating system should also take into account your community goals. Maybe there's something that's technically a lower urgency or priority of your capital need, but it lines up with maybe a short-term community goal that your stakeholders have really supported and would like to see happen. So at the end of the day, each rating system, you'll have similarities between you and your peer communities, but each community might have different priorities or goals for their own city or town. But as long as the rating system is consistent so that whatever capital request is received, it is rated and prioritized in the same methodology as all the other capital requests, that will really build consistency in your capital planning and also get better buy-in from your internal and external stakeholders. And a good capital planning process outlines specific community funding strategies for these capital expenditures. So funding strategies can include things like setting capital target level. For example, a certain percentage of the budget allocated for capital expenditure. You can do the same with setting a debt service target or a benchmark for building specific reserves. Communities should create formal strategy for when they want to consider things like cash versus debt for capital expenses. One strategy that we tend to see in more communities is setting a threshold for cash versus borrowing. So for example, a community may set a rule or a strategy that anything under $100,000 should be purchased outright with a funding source such as free cash instead of borrowing. And again, these thresholds, these targets depend on each of your communities, but again, the goal or the theme of capital planning is consistency and setting the guidelines and putting them in a formal document, whether it's policies or formal outlines of strategies. That way, each year you have consistency in your funding strategy and your choices and how you manage your long-term finance. And if you haven't heard me say policies one too many times already, this is our bread and butter for what we recommend from DLS and from FMRP. So the importance of policies, again, it's maintaining consistency. We all know, especially in local government, you can have internal department heads turnover, you can have administration turnover, you can have new people come on to volunteer elected committees like select board, capital planning committees, finance committees. So policies really instill a sense of consistency in financial management and build that strategy over the long term. So that regardless of who's in the seat, of who's on a committee, what capital requests you're looking at, your policies can really emphasize what your management as a community is, and make sure that you're being consistent over the long term. So a lot of obviously a capital policy is a very important one for capital planning. It goes over a lot of the things that we had talked about previously, defining an asset, outlining responsibility, looking at funding strategies and making target levels or specific funding strategies around those. But then you also have other policies that are related to that are standalone on themselves. So your policies around your financial reserves, your debt management, your budget policy, your financial forecasting, all of these really tie together, not only in terms of your financial policy manual, but if we think back to that Venn diagram of your core financial pillars of your strong financial management, capital plan is one of them, but also financial policies is another important one. And last, but certainly not least, and probably more difficult end of the process is just the actual implementation of your planning and collaboration. It's easy to say you can gather your assets, you can inventory them, you can create a rubric, but how do you actually go about making sure that you're building a capital plan and you're getting the buy-in from internal and external stakeholders alike? So we break it down into kind of three areas, but again, each area is dependent on each community of who handles what. And this is especially true between internal staff, such as your department heads, a town administrator, manager, versus things like boards and committees. So inventory maintenance, this is the actual, compiling the data, looking at those things like asset records, creating that inventory, maintaining that inventory. A lot of the times, more often than not, you'll see internal staff support taking on this role, maybe an administration level, an accounting level, but this is really where we see a lot of the internal operations that are maintaining this documentation. So you have a live document that isn't losing value over the years. Then you have the fiscal planning, which is the part of the, looking at your funding strategies that we talked about, looking at your funding proposals versus, your budget for the next coming year, forecasting the expenses over the long term, looking at costs beyond just the next budget year, but also your 3 to 5 financial outlook years. And then we also have the review and recommendations. And again, between fiscal planning and the review and recommendations, this is where you see a lot of diversity depending on your community. And it's different for communities of every size, every location. Some of the fiscal planning can be done by the boards and committees. Others keep this internal between, for example, administration or maybe a finance director. Whereas review and recommendations tends to be more boards, committees, but we do see having, if you have a town manager or other roles that are outlined as that being their responsibility, you can see their reviews and recommendations being part of the process. So again, it's unique for your community, but establishing, and this is where policies can help come into play, establishing everyone's roles and responsibilities around capital planning, who is responsible for what, when are things due, who gets what information and what roles does everyone play in the process. That at the end of the day, the goal is to bring everyone together so you have the process from start to finish. Everyone has their own piece, but at the end of the day, you have a comprehensive capital plan that you can be bringing to your town meeting floor, to your budget meetings year over year. And we have some great, I think, tools and resources available for communities through DLS. So wanted to highlight some of those I think a lot of you might find helpful, and I'm hoping that you'll take some of these away. We have some great ones in this presentation. But on our Division of Local Services on our website, we have a lot of tools and templates available. So things like the capital targets template, we have financial forecast documents and instructions. We have a lot of different calculators that you can look at, hypothetical impacts of a debt service increase, of a tax impact, things like that. And we also do have a lot of sample materials like a capital budget or sample policies related to capital. We also have some data visualization pages. Basically, you can go and look at your community and you can bring up things like your debt service, your tax levy, your general fund expenditures, things like that. It's always we have a lot of us at DLS are basically data nerds, so we definitely enjoy these pages, and hopefully you will too. But especially if you're not sure where your community is at in their finances or in their, things like their debt service levels, this is a great place to be able to pull up your own community as well as peer communities if you want to try to look at where you are compared to some of your familiar peers. Then I have 2 pages for you guys. So, and I believe they will be giving these presentations out afterwards. If there's any trouble with the links, please let me know. But if you click on any of these are sample documents that please, we're welcoming you to take and take on as your own. I like to think like DLS is like Costco. Our best features are free samples. So we have capital planning budgeting workbook. We have a capital targets template, a debt service calculator, a tax impact calculator. You can download these by just clicking on any of the icons. We can also find a lot of these on our capital plan and managing debt webpage, which I have a link below. I believe we have one more too. DLS samples that FMRB has really created over time. We have a sample capital process manual, capital request form, and capital planning policy. These are great, again, whether you're starting out from scratch or if you just want to reinvigorate your process, make it more robust capital planning. These are great starting points. So please take these manuals, forms, policies, review them. They're a great starting point and baseline for what your capital process should outline, but then you can review and tailor them to your own community so that it fits into your city or town exactly the way you need it. And that is all for my part of the presentation. This is my email. This is some of our websites that I referenced before. So just thank you very much for listening, and I will turn this over to Charlie for his part of the presentation.
Thank you, Casey. Let's see, what am I trying to do? Shoot. I've lost my. Excuse me one moment. I just lost my Zoom control bar here. Thank you. Sorry for the delay. I lost visibility on my Zoom control bar, so I wasn't able to get going. So let me share my screen. So thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I'm going to talk about capital planning in Arlington. It's been a 38-year process since we started our capital planning policies. Just a little bit about my relationship to this subject. I've been in Arlington since 1974 and been active in town meeting. I've spent many years on the capital planning committee. I'm a finance committee member, and I've been involved in the budget and revenue task force and in the long range planning committee. And this last item, the long range planning committee, is important to capital planning because we do a 5-year planning, financial planning process in Arlington. And in the envelope of that financial planning process, we undertake our capital planning. So today we're going to talk a little bit about these items, what a capital plan is, how the capital planning committee is organized. Much of these are sort of grass level, or below the trees level of the concepts that Casey spoke about in her presentation. I think one of the things that is helpful is if you think about a capital plan as a marketing document. And the marketing targets really are three. One is the municipal workforce. The most valuable part of a community government is its staff and employees, its management, and the people who contribute to the services and create the services that the citizens get to enjoy. So that group of people is one of the targets of the capital planning process. The second is the funding authority. In the case of Arlington, that's town meeting. But the funding authority also needs to understand and be comfortable with the capital planning process. And then the third is the public, because they are ultimately the source of funds and the beneficiary of the services. The plan has to have certain structure, timelines, details, and the financing mechanisms. In Arlington, our capital planning committee is composed of both public citizens, volunteers, as well as town staff. And this is has been a very workable formula, because we bring to it the sort of the fiscal conservatism as well as the fiscal energy, the political energy of public citizens, interested public citizens. But we also bring the professional expertise of our town manager, treasurer, a representative of the school department, typically the financial superintendent, and the town comptroller. So these people work together during the capital planning process to create the annual capital plan. And the capital plan is ultimately presented to town meeting, and the capital budget is ultimately presented to town meeting along with a capital plan for town meeting approval. How we organize the capital planning committee with two things in mind. One is each of these vertical categories that you see here is sort of it's a group, that a subcommittee or a sub-working group that creates a certain amount of subject matter expertise about the departments that are shown underneath each block. And why is that necessary? Well, it's necessary because, and I think Casey mentioned this, you need continuity and consistency, or I like to refer to it as sort of a cultural memory, an institutional memory, understanding what happened in the past and what needs to happen in the future. So each of these subcommittees become expert in these department areas. But the other thing we do is we organize these departments so that the town staff or town executive that's serving on this group is not, they're not managing their own budgets. They're not making recommendations on their own budgets. And that helps to create some objectivity across all the departments, and especially between town and school. And it's important to have that in developing a plan in which people are enthusiastic about, which people are enthusiastic about, and in which they have trust and confidence. Well, these capital programs can be big, and they can take a long time, and things can go wrong. So we have to have a long view, and we'll discuss how we try to do that today. The three core reasons that we have a capital plan is that citizens need capital planning, because the capital assets of a town, that's the infrastructure in which services are delivered. And our municipal employees rely on capital planning because, as I said before, our employees, our staff, our executives, they're the most important asset in the town, but they can't deliver their services if they don't have adequate assets, tools, and an environment in which to deliver these services. And then finally, the capital assets cost money, and money, as we all know, doesn't grow on trees, and we have to figure out on an annual basis how much money we can devote to the capital spending process. I like to think about capital planning as being a critical as a critical tool to set and meet long-term expectations for current and future capital expenditures. And the expectations we set are for town executives, for department managers, for the finance committee, for the town meetings, and ultimately for citizenry. And in the process of setting and meeting these expectations, we reduce or eliminate uncertainty. Now, one of the aspects of capital requirements is that every department manager or the school or town or whatever, their capital needs are typically immediate. Something has to happen, but you can't do everything at once. These acquisitions have to be spread out over time, and requires a certain amount of collegiality between department managers or between the town and the school. And this is a process of what I refer to as delayed gratification. Not my invention. Psychologist Abraham Maslow originally coined the phrase. But the fire department has to be able to delay the acquisition of a fire truck in order to let the DPW department pick up some new graders or something like that. And it's that process of delaying gratification and willing to say, okay, I'm going to be able to get that pumper in 2 years because we have a capital plan that actually makes the capital plan work. And finally, successful capital planning gives town meeting and voters comfort while spending large sums of taxpayers' money, and can also help improve town's bond rating. And it's important, spending money is one of the most critical parts of a town meeting or a municipal legislative authority. And the reason they're there is to spend money, but they like to do it only if they're comfortable that it's the right thing to do, and a capital plan provides that capability. So one of the conundrums of capital planning of a capital planning committee is to discern between capital projects and maintenance projects. And Casey very adequately, very importantly described the need for maintenance, but maintenance is an operating cost, not a capital cost. So, and we have a facilities department in Arlington that actually worries about maintenance as well as making capital requests. But basically, maintenance is a repeating operating expense, regular frequency, and modest cost, where capital is infrequent and a higher cost. And I would notice that there are a number of outside firms. One of them is this On-Site Insight that can help you do an inventory and help you create a asset life plan for both maintenance and replacement of capital items. And we've used that service in Arlington, and it's been very effective. We also classify capital assets, and this is something that everybody can have a different view on, but it's got to be greater than $3,000, tangible, have a depreciable life of more than 3 years. And there's a number of recommendations. Casey may mention some of them, both in Mass General Law and at DOR, that can help you come up with a capital asset classification system. Basic examples of the capital assets that we deal with inside our non-exempt budgeting process: rolling stock, buildings, office equipment, parks, gardens, fields, all of the things that you would expect that would be capital assets. One thing to note is that sometimes building plans and studies can be a capital budget item, provided that they result in the acquisition or creation of a capital asset. And the state law allows for that. But typically, building studies and plans are not capital assets. Things that we have had requests in the capital planning process for that were not capital assets are various services, painting, rooms, books for students, field maintenance. And it's important that these things not get involved in your capital budget, because they don't meet the criteria that you set up for capital assets. Excuse me, we have developed guidelines for prioritizing our capital projects. At the top is threat to health and safety of citizens. And then you can see the others here: maintenance of capital assets or improvement, state or federal law, improvement of infrastructure, improvement of productivity, and relief of an overburdened situation. So these provide the basic framework for the capital planning committee to prioritize capital acquisitions. In Arlington, the town manager owns the capital budget. The town manager manages purchasing, implementation, maintenance, and departments, etc. Sometimes the school superintendent assumes some specific ownership of capital assets within the school department. Department heads request capital purchases because somebody has to have custody, care, and control of the asset over its life. We have had examples where private citizens have approached the capital planning committee, but you can't go out and acquire a tool or an asset at the request of a citizen and hand it over to the citizen. It belongs to the town, and the town has to manage it and maintain it and use it over a period of time. The capital planning committee reviews the recommendations and requests from department managers, and then it also arbitrates and recommends a budget plan. When I say arbitrates, I mean going back to that example of the fire chief wanting to get a new pumper. That arbitration between the fire department and the DPW, or perhaps between some town objectives and school objectives, is managed by the capital planning committee, which has representatives from these various constituencies on the committee, as well as citizens. The town meeting, the financial, the town capital planning committee recommends a budget and a plan to the town manager, to the finance committee, and town meeting. And town meeting ultimately approves a capital budget and plan. And we have a rolling 5-year plan, but the first year is actually the capital budget for a given fiscal year. So the process works something like this. The department generates these requests with their departmental 5-year plan starting in August. And then from September to January, the capital planning committee sifts, filters, arbitrates, whatever, develops the 1-year budget and the 5-year plan, which is then, excuse me, processed through the town manager and the finance committee, goes to the spring town meeting. The money is available on July 1st for funding the acquisitions. And here we are at August again. So you can see that a good capital planning process is really a full year operation. So what are the sources of funds? How do you fund capital acquisition? So for the most part, our capital acquisitions come from Proposition 2.5 non-exempt funds. That is the annual municipal budget that's within the limitations of Proposition 2.5. And in Arlington, we don't use stabilization funds to finance capital projects. We use either cash, direct cash from the current year's operating the total budget, or we fund an acquisition through bonds, which are non-exempt bonds and get paid through the non-exempt annual budget. Other sources include grants, CDBG money, trusts, enterprise funds, and other off-balance sheet items. We refer to that as other. We're very poetic with our nomenclature in Arlington. And then the other category of spending comes from Proposition 2.5 exempt funds, either a direct expenditure or debt exclusion. And generally speaking, if the project or the acquisition is too large to fit within the 5-year capital plan that's developed in the non-exempt budgeting process, we need to go to a 2.5 exempt funding acquisition, which means directly going to the citizens in a referendum. And a final category for capital spending is the Community Preservation Act. And some things, for example, historic preservation or certain parks and recreation facilities can be funded through the Community Preservation Act. And the Capital Planning Committee coordinates with the Community Preservation Committee to optimize that process. So with the funds that are acquired through the previously mentioned categories, they're used for the purchase of qualifying equipment according to the criteria that we've set up, or the funds are spent on interest on bonds or bond anticipation notes, or paying down the principal on bonds, or distinguishing between paying exempt or non-exempt debt service. So how we define the bounds of the capital budget are basically direct. We have, as I mentioned, direct cash expenditures. We have interest and principal, and then we have debt service. Okay, so the sum of the cash purchases, new debt service, prior debt service equals 5% of the town's non-exempt capital budget. So the Capital Planning Committee presents a fairly comprehensive report to the town meeting every year. And this, of course, as I mentioned earlier, has been coordinated with and approved by the Finance Committee and the town manager prior to going to town meeting. And you can find examples of that going to the category reports to town meeting on the Town of Arlington website. One of the things we do in the capital report is we show the town, the managers, the department managers, the town meeting members, and the public what's been spent in prior years. So here you see the actual acquisition history of the capital budget over the period 2020 to 2024. Now, the interesting thing to notice here is that this number in 2020 is quite huge. And that's larger than, you're thinking to yourself, that's much larger than 5% of the town's budget. But when you borrow money, you're not, this is bonds, right? The red button up here. When you're borrowing money, you're not paying that down in 1 year. It's spread out over 5, 10, 20, or sometimes 30 years. So the cash flow impact is much smaller. But so this large bonding acquisition, and then another one in fiscal 21, you notice they drop down in the next several years because the debt service on these is flowing through the planning process or the budgeting process, and you can't just keep borrowing money every year. To keep total expenditures within the 5% impact. And we'll show you how you do that. So as I mentioned, we want to calculate the year's forecast budget, adjust for exempt debt, and then add in the new debt service and add in the direct cash expenditures, and then compare the budget. So this is a hypothetical bond expenditure. Assume it's $1 million and it's a 5-year bond. So in the first year, there might be very small, maybe half the interest rate is the only impact on the annual budget. But in the next year, you have to pay the full interest plus debt service. So, but as you hit that debt service, the bond, the outstanding debt goes down, and finally it disappears. And in this way, this is a sort of a beneficial mechanism within the budgeting process, because as you pay down the debt service, this creates headroom for different capital acquisitions. So if you think back to that historical slide I showed a couple of seconds ago, there was a big acquisition in 2020. But then in the future years, the acquisitions had to be smaller because this debt service wasn't disappearing fast enough. Eventually, it goes down to zero, and that means that, you know, conceptually, you could go back and do another big bond financing to acquire a capital asset. And you know, the details are shown here in this table. Now, how do we forecast the debt service? So we have a whole series of Microsoft Access and Microsoft Excel tools that we use, but basically, we compute the debt service impact of each acquisition over future years. So, for example, in this snippet of our plan, you see that the fire services future debt service is sort of jumping all over the place, right? It starts out at one number, it goes up in 2027 and 28. But in each individual item, the debt service is declining because we're paying down the principal and interest. But if out here in 28, we've made another acquisition, so the debt service pops up again. So we do this for every acquisition and every department and accumulate the total debt service that goes into the capital budgeting plan. So this is one of the tools in getting to that number that has to go into the plan. And so we take the prior debt service, real numbers, right? The cash expenditure, and then the new non-exempt service that's forecast from that table I just showed you on the prior slide. And this gives you the total non-exempt capital planning, capital budget and planning costs that's going to go into the budget. Now we also make some adjustments. I won't drag you through these, but these are adjustments from, for example, I'll just give you one. The town voted many years ago that antenna funds would go to contributing towards the capital assets of the town's parks. So the antenna funds basically can offset some of the capital costs. So anyway, this results, after you make these adjustments, this results in the net non-exempt plan. And this is what has to be 5% of the budget each year. So in this process, we forecast the non-exempt debt balances that we have, the new non-exempt debt, and the existing historical non-exempt debt, which is declining, to come up with the total non-exempt balances. And we do the same thing with the exempt debt, so that we can calculate the total debt that the town is incurring. And the reason we want to do that is because the state has a limitation on how much outstanding debt a town is allowed to have. So this is the estimated total debt balance of Arlington during this time frame. And this is the black area is the non-exempt debt, and this total checkered area here is the exempt debt. And of course, that's a big number, and driven mostly by the improvements that the town has made, financing renovations to elementary schools and building a new high school. So the state has an inside debt limit and an outside debt limit. This compares the total outstanding debt of the town to the state's limitation as a percentage of the maximum allowed debt. And you can see that the capital planning committee, even in the face of acquiring a brand new high school at $290 million, is still less than half of the statutory debt limit. And this is a tool that we use to compare every year to make sure that the debt isn't getting out of hand. This is the major building projects over recent years, which comprises a lot of the capital acquisition costs. And you can see that the exempt debt that I showed you just in the previous slide there is mostly educational buildings, because the cost is just too big to fit within the 5% budget. So the town goes directly to the voters and says, look, if you really want to get these elementary schools renovated or improved, or you want to have a new high school, which we desperately needed, the town citizens have the opportunity to vote directly for a debt exclusion campaign, which provides the funds to move those projects forward. So in that environment, how do we actually manage to the 5%? So I showed you before the net non-exempt plan numbers, 9 million, 10 million, these numbers here. And the 5-year, the long-range planning committee, consisting of many individuals in the town, as citizens as well as the town management, comes up with a forecast of what the town budgets are going to be over the next 5 years. So we plan the budget at 5%. So calculating that, this line is the theoretical budget for capital plan based on the 5-year operating budgets that the town have. So what you can see here is that the capital planning budget is $1,000 under the 5% in fiscal 24, but fiscal 25 and 26 it's negative, but over the whole period of time it's 5%. Okay, so what happens in fiscal 25? Do we go over budget? No. In fiscal 25, the capital planning committee looks through the budget and filters out some projects, pushing them off into the future, so that in fiscal 25, when it goes to town meeting, the budget's at 5%. So this is a governing mechanism. It's like a governor in an automobile engine that doesn't let you go past a certain speed. So it guarantees that the budget every year is going to be within 5% of the actual revenue. Some of the projects that we've done, new high school, I mentioned it's a fantastic building, $290 million, about 40% of it was funded by the MSBA. It's not complete yet because we've had to build it in place, but it's basically 3 phases have been complete and it's on budget and on schedule. We have, I can't remember, but I think we're finished, but we have a brand new DPW facility that we've built. Again, this has been funded out of the non-exempt capital budget. Many different police vehicles, fire equipment, et cetera, get covered by these projects. So all of these things require town meeting support. So, and in some of your towns and cities, you may have a town council or board of aldermen or whatever. So, but that's an approval authority. And in order to get the capital budget to move forward, you have to get that approval authority to vote for and approve your budget. So we do this because we have a capital plan as well as a budget, which, as I mentioned before, is the first year of the capital plan. Whenever possible, we try to stick to that plan. If there's bad news, get it out there as soon as possible, preferably years in advance, as opposed to giving people a surprise. And always highlight the problems. Don't gloss them over. Give the approval authority, in our case, town meeting, give them credit for capital spending within the plan, because then they get ownership of the plan. And if you give town meeting credit for wisely spending large amounts of money, that's what they want to do, and they're happy to do it. And having a capital plan and a history to look at every year is proof. So following this process, we've had 35, actually 38 years of town meeting votes, most votes unanimous, and I think over the entire period we've only had one change in the budgeting process. So what's the capital planning committee role? Set standards and priorities, provide continuity and institutional memory, inspire and cajole. And I don't say that in any negative way, but you have to get department managers and executives to agree, sometimes in a contentious environment. So the capital planning committee has to provide leadership in getting people to work together. And you have to reward the people who have entered into this plan by securing the funding in the plan horizon. And finally, you have to communicate the short-term and long-term needs to the town manager, the finance committee, town meeting, citizens, et cetera, and do so with gravitas. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Casey. Very informative. Lots of great information shared there. We'd like to transition to some questions and answers now. So we see some Q&As, some questions lined up in the Q&A section of Zoom. Please go ahead, folks, and put more questions in there. And we'll engage the panelists and help answer your questions. Starting at the top here, will you make templates like the capital inventory spreadsheet or the rubric available? Casey, I believe your slides did have some links to those.
Yes,
but
and
maybe you can
I believe it's within the capital planning policy manual, the sample document. It has some of those template forms within it. But yes, you should be able to download that and also find our website.
That's great. Yeah, lots of information there to go through with. As a reminder to all, the presentations will be sent out to all by email after we're done here today, and the video will be available online as well. Next question: how can we avoid too common underfunding of maintenance of existing assets like water mains or sidewalks? Does DLS audit, quote, proper maintenance funding?
I think I'm not aware of any audits, but I think the best thing to do is, honestly, it goes back to having your inventory and having your assets detailed out for you, just knowing, and that applies to things like your roads, your buildings, your infrastructure, knowing when was the date that they were created or last improved, what's the life expectancy attached from that date, where they are in their life cycle. Tracking costs. This is where a lot of department heads, especially, in terms of roads, like public safety officials, their knowledge about watching the costs, of inflation, so that you have those scenarios, unfortunately, where you can do an improvement this year for maybe 100,000, but if you wait 2 years, it might all of a sudden be double or more than the cost. So I think it's a balance of making sure that you're ahead of the life expectancy of your assets, to the best of your ability, and also just having that finger on the pulse of what's happening with your individual costs. And that's where I think you can have a lot of great communication with your individual department heads in that regard.
Thank you, Casey. Next question, and I think this is in the context of what might be available for free cash to use towards capital projects, but what is the preferred method of determining free cash? I believe available for capital funding.
Oh, I can tell you what we do in Arlington. We set up a series of reserves in the budget every year, and we have a free cash basically reserve, and we take half of that, half of the funds that are contributed that are declared free cash at the end of the year, and use that as revenue in the next year, and put the other 50% into a reserve account. Okay, so we don't specifically say we're going to use a certain amount of free cash for capital. We say that we're going to use 5% of the total operating budget for capital.
Understood. Thanks, Charlie. Here's a question about debt maturity and debt structure, level principal versus level debt service. In the context of planning your debt load, your debt structure.
Well, we've done both, and we just have done it based on the size of the project and what we thought optimized our 5-year plan.
I think, both are acceptable. I think in my context, I see a lot more preference for the level principal. It does create the kind of the stagnating bars, obviously, because you have the higher interest in the beginning years and then it lowers. But I think we see some preference towards that, because what people often do is, as that debt's falling off and they have those larger, debt service open up, they're ideally adding new debt service to that. So it's kind of balancing out over time, instead of all of a sudden having debt completely fall off and then maybe struggling to fulfill that gap and not have it get sucked back into operational budgets.
That makes sense. Charlie, I think you touched on this next question here in your discussion, but given their significant expense, how do you recommend funding things like building technical assessments or design studies? How to roll that into your capital planning process?
Well, for example, if you are going to build a new high school, if you're pretty sure that it's going to result in a capital acquisition, then you can look at the planning documents for that as a capital cost, and that's allowed by the state. And on the other hand, I'll give you an example of a study that was requested for capital expenditure but was not accepted. We have a master plan for the town, and when we originally put it together about 8 or 9 years ago, I think it was going to cost $50,000 or $100,000, but it's not a capital asset. That's a study, right? So that had to be funded out of the operating budget. So if you're going to buy a specialized piece of equipment or improve a park or something like that, that's going to result in a capital acquisition or expenditure, then the study can fit into the capital plan.
And I know some communities may have some certain amount of funds available, ahead of time to do that capital planning, such that they have some study funds, sort of built into their plan, as opposed to requesting those each time that they're needed. Is an important role of the town's capital budget outlay committee to actually voice opinion and review all future capital budget items and any revisions in priorities?
I think it again goes back to what you define your roles in your individual communities. What we often encourage is have as many meetings jointly between your different boards, committees as possible. I mean, if you're looking at your budget season, you're going in with maybe your town administrator, your finance director, or someone internal stakeholder presenting things like a financial forecast, a preliminary budget, or maybe just goals and objectives of the budget year. Having just a simple meeting where you have maybe select board, finance committee, and your capital committee in the room, hearing, what the challenges are for the year, what the financial forecast is looking at, both positive and negative, reviewing at saying, these are the capital expenditures we received, and we're going to get back to with our, opinions of priority or funding. Having those meetings all together, I think helps not only disseminate all the information at once to everyone, but then the individual roles, I think you can define through that, of having everyone on the same page of saying, this is from the internal workers saying, this is what we think the priority should be for capital this year and how we should fund it. And then by the time you get to the individual communities, you'll find a lot of the same sentiments echoed. But if it comes to individual roles of the committees, I think that's where you should have it defined. Ideally, if you have a charter, but through bylaw, through your formal policy documents, defining who's in charge of what, because it does vary across the state, but making sure everyone has a defined role, I think will eliminate a lot of that gray area that can kind of cause some trouble for communities.
Thank you. Next question here is kind of sort of a timely question, and it's questioning whether there's any samples or support for integrating a municipal decarbonization plan within your capital planning.
Not that I'm aware of, but that's a good one I can bring back to the office for sure. That's one I haven't heard of, so I'm always happy to bring something new back.
Great. Here's a question about multi-year planning. How long is a multi-year plan, especially since some of the very biggest investments, like school buildings, may occur only very infrequently and not be visible in a 3 or 5 year plan. We pay for these largest investments over a 30-year period, and they should have useful lives over 50 years. So are there examples of a 30-year rough, low-resolution forecast in addition to a more granular 3 or 5 year forecast?
I think that's where your inventory really comes in handy. A lot of the times what I see in communities is they have like you said, the granular 3 to 5 year forecast, and then they have tentative, benchmarks of future years that are based on their inventory. So if their inventory says this is what we have building wise for the next 20 to 40 years, they might have fiscal year benchmarks that are kind of echoed in a spreadsheet, maybe in 2035 or 2040, but the actual funding and nitty gritty strategy and strategic plan is kind of encapsulated to the 3 to 5 year mark. Because beyond 5 year, I know a lot of communities, they do 10 years, but even we've gotten feedback where obviously beyond 3 to 5, there's so many things that you can't predict in that time frame, that it's more of a keep in mind sort of thing beyond 5 years, and the main bread and butter is within that 3 to 5.
Jeremy, I might add, in Arlington, you asked the question before about studies. So in Arlington, I think it was in 1991, we did a study of all our elementary schools, and we came up with a need to renovate or improve most of them. And we originally set out to do that in 6 or 7 years. It actually took 15, but we eventually, you saw the list that I showed earlier, we eventually got all of those elementary schools, including the middle schools, renovated or rebuilt, and then moved on to the high school.
Yeah, and I would imagine that those facility studies that are looking at your buildings, would have sort of that longer range look at the
Right.
facilities needs. Here's a good question about the distinction between capital and operating expenses. There's certain capital expenses you kind of incur every year, such as roadway maintenance. Maybe that's funded $250,000 per year. That's in your capital plan. Is that considered in any way differently than things that are non-recurring?
Well, all capital expenses are recurring. They simply have a longer life. In other words, a school building might have a life of 25 or 30 years, but it's still going to be recurring. And in the case of roadways, there are two comments. One, it has a long life, or it should have a long life, more than a year. And those expenditures that from on roadways apply to different roads. They don't necessarily apply to the same specific capital asset. So I think they're legitimately capital.
Are there ways, if there's sort of a known level of spend for that sort of expense for roadways, and it's known you need a certain amount per year over the course of a number of years, are there any ways to help budget for that might be more advantageous?
Well, I don't know. I'll turn that one over to Casey.
I mean, I'm not sure. I think it's one of those, I hate to give a non-answer, but I mean, each community, the amount of just road miles you have in a community can be to compare to your budget. I mean, especially out, I'm sure in Western Mass, you have such large land areas, but comparative to your budget, that's an internal choice that you have to do. It's not a bad idea to try to be setting. I know some people, I've seen some DPW directors and look at doing a percentage of the road miles that they have. Others do a percentage of the budget. But I do think that there is a balance of fitting maybe a certain maintenance level of we're going to do a little bit this year. But then if you have, for example, if you have an excess of free cash one year because you had a really great local receipts year, having that additional policy of saying, all right, we're going to do a percentage of this free cash to do capital expenditures to get ahead of our roadway project, or maybe repair something that maybe there was more of a bad winter that the priority level is kind of changing because of that. I think it's a balance, but it's not a bad idea to have something within your operating to keep ahead of it, and then having the capital expenditures again be kind of the additional or the get ahead, or maybe reserving it for those high priority or those unexpected repairs that you didn't anticipate doing at that time.
Next question is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of establishing a capital stabilization fund? I guess relatedly, there's a question as to why Arlington chooses not to use stabilization funds for capital projects.
Well, when we started the capital budgeting process, we didn't have stabilization funds in place. I mean, they were allowed, but we didn't have the stabilization funds. So we needed to organize the capital expenditures, and it just turned out that the interest rates were, it's if you put that in the stabilization fund and you let the interest accumulate on it, that builds up the fund. But similarly, if you borrow the money, you get the money now, and you're not waiting before the capital expenditure takes place. So we just found that the other benefit of a bonding process is that it guarantees that the money gets spent on the asset, and somebody can't move into the stabilization fund and decide to spend it elsewhere.
I think the advantage and disadvantage are similar. It's about specifics. So when you create a capital stabilization fund, you're being more specific for its use, and you can either go. Some people go further and designate, a specialty, stabilization fund for maybe a specific capital purpose or a need that they're seeing in the future. So obviously, it's limiting in that because you don't have the same, uses available to you as if you had like a general or all-purpose stabilization fund. But and then I think some of the disadvantage, it can be about your individual community's buy-in. If you have a general stabilization fund, the disadvantage you might encounter some people saying, why do we have to fund this? We don't want to just throw our money into something that doesn't have a clear definition or defined use in their eyes. But the advantage of that is that when capital expenses come down the line, especially if it's something that's during a high inflation year, or people are very sensitive about the taxes, having an additional source to be able to dilute the burden on the tax bill can be very advantage. It's just a matter of you have to be able to build up those reserves and maintain those that stabilization fund for that purpose, because you can run into a situation where it was created but really wasn't maintained, and then the actual dollar value of it depreciates more quickly than its use.
Yeah, and I think that can be a real challenge for communities to have a constant, regular revenue source for that capital stabilization fund. Without that, the one-time funds you may put in there are useful, but without a recurring source, it's harder to budget to use those funds. Any ideas as far as potential sources of funds to fund a capital stabilization fund?
I mean, you can always designate part of certain receipts, or you're having specific funding strategies. Again, it could be back to free cash of a percentage of free cash goes into certain stabilization funds. I've seen communities where in their policies, if they have a section for free cash, they do a priority list of what free cash is going towards. So it might not be a necessary specific target percentage or target level, but might be prioritization. And you can, community can absolutely do a higher priority towards stabilization or reserve funds. So even though, free cash, we don't like to call it a recurring cost because you're not guaranteed it every year. But if you are concerned about your reserves or want to build it for a specific purpose, by all means, you can take things like, free cash and allocate them according to the priority that you see fit in your community.
I've seen some communities have financial policies where like the revenue from rooms and meals taxes
Exactly.
goes directly toward, that's what they use for their capital stabilization fund.
Exactly. That's a good one. I think that's becoming more popular too.
Great. Charlie, this question I think is directed for you. It sounds as though Arlington does not have trouble passing 2.5% overrides. Is that right?
Well, we passed a number of them. Let me put it that way. The elementary schools were funded through 2 debt exclusion votes, and the high school was funded through a debt exclusion vote. We've also had several overrides for the operating budgets, and so I don't know if you can say we didn't have any trouble, because it takes a lot of work to get a vote like that passed through the citizens, and we have had a couple turned down over the years, but most of them have been successful.
Is there an average debt service ratio for towns in Massachusetts? Is there a target, or is there some suggested guidance from DLS for debt service?
It depends on community. A lot of our sample policies can include things like 5 to 8%. But again, it depends on your community and how it ties into other things. If there's other reserves, if your community is, I've seen some communities that are very adverse to borrowing. I've seen some that are almost overly enthusiastic about borrowing, or they have a specific strategy around. We have a lot of our financial policies, we post them all on the financial management resource page. So you'll see a lot of similar things, like, again, I said 5 to 8, sometimes it's 7 to 10, sometimes it depends on the community and also the size of your budget. But I highly recommend going to our website, pulling up any of the financial policies. You can search by project type. So if you just search by financial policies, You can find all the communities we've done, especially if you find a peer community or one that you find yourself very financially similar to. I would definitely look at some of the policies we've done for those and see if those policies can be adapted to your community.
That's a great suggestion, Casey. Thank you. We have about 5 more minutes for questions and answers. At some point, there will be a link to a review of the webinar, so please fill that out. If we don't get to your question today, I'm sure Casey and Charlie would welcome you to reach out to them to help answer any of the questions that you may have, either that we didn't get to or that you think of later. Let's carry on here while we still have some time. There's a question about how a community's statutory debt limit is calculated.
Listen, we got some great webinars on debt. You can go all into it. I'd be happy to forward some. It's one of those things that's a big conversation around all things surrounding debt, and both excluded and non-excluded. So I will happily share some resources, some of that conversation.
There's a question about which tool is best to show declining retiring of debt over a period of maybe 10 years.
So I would say the debt service template. I believe we might have one. If this is not in the presentation that I had today, it's definitely on our website. We have basically a debt service template, which is just or a debt schedule template, I should say. I would say that's the best thing to have, because I would say you would have your individual debt borrowings. You can, project them over a number of years, and then you can have a spreadsheet that combines them all. But that's what you really want to see. As long as you have the numbers, you can create, an Excel or other document that just shows your total debt, even breaking it down between principal and interest and seeing how that's either rising or declining over your next, 5 to 10 years.
Here's a question regarding a town that currently plans to use only free cash to pay for capital expenditures. And how does a cash-strapped town change that so that they become less averse to using debt for capital?
I think if it's a difficult conversation, one is just emphasizing the need for your capital needs and just communicating effectively the capital expenses that you might be looking at and how much that will cost, how much that will basically hurt if it's all at once versus if you can kind of build them up. And maybe the strategy for you is start small. Maybe it's 1% of the budget for the first year. Maybe it's 1.5 to 2% the next year. Just building in that starting point of working into your budget document, percentage or a target amount to use, and then just communicating that your target might be 5% of the budget, but we understand that that's not feasible right now. So we're going to start at 1, and we're going to have a 5-year plan to increase that percent each year. Maybe it's something like that, that if you're having if it's a hard rhetoric to communicate, maybe just start small and just be consistent over your next couple fiscal years.
Mm-hmm. Question about the terms capital improvement plan as opposed to capital improvement program. Both terms used today, are they the same? Are they different?
Yeah, we like to use more words than necessary at the state government. So they're all the same. I think having your program or your plan is your actual document that says this is what you're going to be, buying over the next couple of years or funding or borrowing for. And then your capital planning process is just the process to create said plan. So one is the method and one is the result.
Thank you. Let's take one more question here. For Arlington, how do you limit your exempt debt service? You limit your non-exempt to 5%.
That's a good question. I think the answer is that the citizens make that decision. It's not the town manager or the superintendent of schools or one of the committees or whatever. It goes to a referendum. And if the citizens are willing to spend the money gets spent and the taxes go up. It's a political decision.
Well, thank you all for coming today, and a special thanks to our panelists, Casey and Charlie, and thanks to all of you for attending today's program. The link to the webinar evaluation has been or will be posted in the chat, and we encourage everyone to complete it. The survey link will also be sent via email to all attendees. And as a reminder, this program was recorded and will be posted on the MMA website and MMA on demand within the next few days, along with the slides. All attendees will also receive the materials via email. With that, I'd like to close out today and thank you all for coming and participating, and wish you all well.